Thank you so much for joining us today for the first ever NAMI Wisconsin Growing Stronger Together virtual event. I'm Megan McLaughlin. I'm the program coordinator at NAMI Wisconsin. Although we are not able to gather in person, we are so grateful you have joined us today. Before we get started with our next presentation, let's have a quick icebreaker poll. Here's the question. Would you rather A, become invisible one day a month, or B, fly, but only to and from work? So I'll give you a minute there to answer that. So the results are in. Become invisible one day a month at 59%, so it's pretty close. The flying was at 41%. So now that we've had a little fun, let's get started. At the end of each presentation, we'll have a 15-minute Q&A session. You can ask questions throughout the presentation in the Q&A box on your Zoom toolbar. We encourage you to ask many questions to spark conversation. Now, it is my honor to introduce you to Lissa Jones-Lofgren and her presentation, Racial Equality is a Verb. Lissa embraces opportunities to bring a more robust, complex, and thoughtful examination of Black life and culture into public discourse. Lissa is a lover of history, literature, learning, teaching, and the power of voice. She is an equity and culture coach, a radio producer, a podcast host, and a grandmother of twins. Lissa, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to see all of you and grateful for your time today. One thing we share in common when we're talking about mental health is the idea that we understand stigma and discrimination and bad public attitudes and misinformed narratives, and the way that those things can really inform us about the value of a life or about whether a person deserves to have a life if they're living under stigma. Today, I want to spend a little time with you talking about those ideas of stigma and discrimination, of bad public attitudes and misinformed narratives, specifically today at the intersection of race and culture. The whole objective of your conference is learning so that you can grow stronger together. If we don't get better narratives about each other in our own humanity, it's going to be difficult for all of us to grow stronger together. So it's my hope that today you will get some perhaps new information or an affirmation of what you already knew, but an expansion of information you have about Black people and Black culture, and about the mythologies and realities of race. Next slide, please. Thank you. Race is assigned, but culture is chosen. We have grown up in a society that is very raced. When I was in elementary school, for example, we were taught to sing a song, "This land is your land, this land is my land," from the Redwood Forest to the New York Islands. And everyone sang it. We didn't know any better, but it wasn't our land. And so from a very young age, we are socialized around ideas, particularly about race and about how people are assigned a value dependent on their race. We are not often taught to see culture, which is a compilation of many things that really do not include this sociological construct called race. So race is assigned, but culture is chosen. And my hope is you'll understand more about that as we proceed through this time together. Next slide. Please, thank you. If you're looking in Webster's dictionary today and you're looking up the definition of white, it will say all these things: free from spot or blemish, free from moral impurity, innocent, marked by upright fairness. The picture I juxtapose next to it really talks about what we're talking about even in today's time and context when we're talking about race, about a group of people who were brought to a place in order to build a place for someone else. And were not brought by request, but by a different way. And then we developed a language that made certain that everybody who was white would feel as though it was innocent and free of blemish, their skin, and that anybody who was not white, according to Peggy McIntosh, which we will learn later, was somehow raced. This actually happened in our history. And I don't know exactly how we can juxtapose this kind of treatment of a group of people with the definition of innocent for a different group of people who held power over this condition. Next slide, please. Black. In your computer, when you go to type the words white and black, if your computer is anything like mine, it will capitalize white and it will not capitalize black. So the APA decided in its writing format about 2 months ago to capitalize both the words white and black. And now, according to the dictionary, both will be capitalized as well. You see them juxtaposed that way in my slides to bring attention to that. It took 2020, 400 plus years, for black to be seen as equal in words in the APA format and in the dictionary to the word white. But when we look at the description of black people, dirty, soiled, sinister, indicative of condemnation or discredit, the opposite of white, the opposite of free from blemish, the opposite of free from impurity, the opposite of innocent. I juxtapose this picture next to it because this did not happen and is not likely to happen. But it draws a stark contrast for people because it's something we don't expect quite to see. Next slide, please. According to Peggy McIntosh, when she came to the St. Paul Foundation for their Facing Race conference, she came up with what she called the 5 myths that support white privilege. These are what I would argue the 5 myths plus 1 that killed George Floyd and that continue to misinform the stigma, discrimination, bad public attitudes, and misinformed narratives about Black people and Black culture. Peggy teaches the myth of meritocracy. She says, according to this myth, every individual is responsible for his or her own destiny, or in the case of today's context, his, her, or they, their own destiny, not influenced by society or circumstance. Peggy says this allows denial of any systems of oppression or privilege. The suggestion, for example, that Black people don't do well in Minnesota or Wisconsin or in many other parts of the country because we are inherently inferior, lazy, don't want to work, incapable of figuring it out, don't quite have a brain to get it, suggests that there isn't a leg up for one group of people and a leg down for everybody else. It suggests that we started at the same place and we just sort of, by our own doing, ended up in one place or another. But that's not true. And we know 8 minutes and 46 seconds of tape show us that that is not the case. We absolutely are influenced by our time and circumstance. Peggy teaches us about manifest destiny in the myths of the land. She says, in this myth, God gave white people the land that formed the United States. She said, this allows the denial that we live on land taken from indigenous people whose culture and existence white people sought to destroy. If you'd like to dig further, there's a book called I Have Spoken. It's a compilation of speeches largely from indigenous chiefs to the United States military, documenting the indigenous people's experience when the military came over to settle what they called their land and created what they call the deed that took the land from the people originally. White racelessness, the standard. Peggy says, white people are normal and set the standard for what it means to be human. Non-whites have a race, she says, which causes a problem for them and for us. The Pulitzer Prize winning author, Toni Morrison, said, American means you're white. Everybody else has to hyphenate. African American, Asian American, Indigenous American, you get it. The myth of monoculture. There's only one American culture, and when people of color don't assimilate, they aren't behaving appropriately. This is a deadly myth. This suggests that if everyone doesn't behave as you see white people behave, that they are somehow deviant. If you can't argue with it on the face of what seems utterly ridiculous, regardless of color, you really ask yourself, would you model yourself after an invention that hurts people? White moral elevation. Peggy says, white people are in charge of the world and entrusted with power. This, she says, justifies a sense of internalized superiority when encountering those who are not white. This has happened to me, riding on my bicycle. And in Minneapolis, we have bike lights where you actually can see on the traffic light a little bike. It's kind of cute. It's red and yellow and green, just like a regular light, but it has a little bike and it tells you when you can go. And oftentimes, for matters of safety, when you're driving around here and biking around here, the bike light will turn on a little bit before the car light so that the pedestrians and bikers can go across first. And so as my husband and I are getting ready to cross, somebody starts yelling at us and flailing their arms and all kinds of things. And we didn't even know they were talking to us till we got closer. And he's calling us all kinds of names and telling us that we went against the traffic and we did not follow the signal. He couldn't even see the signal from where he was standing, but he was drinking. And so we kept thinking, what in the world would possess him to think that he could tell two grown-ups where they could go when he couldn't even tell us he couldn't even tell what we were doing, because he thought he needed to explain to us in his justified sense of superiority. Unless, I guess we can't figure it out. Last one, I call the myth plus one. It's the myth of what's called the white man's burden. It was invented in 1899 in a poem by Rudyard Kipling. It was a poem titled The United States and the Philippine Islands, the White Man's Burden. It's a poem about the Philippine-American War, which exhorts the United States to assume colonial control of the Filipino people and their country. It's imperialism. It's saying that I have come to this place where there are not white people, and now all of you are my burden, and it's my job to fix it. Suggesting that the people don't, in their own right, have the capacity to live their own lives and to figure it out for themselves, uninhibited. Next slide, please. Race as a verb. One of the biggest problems with the myth of race is the reality of racism, that the beliefs we hold, the stigma, discrimination, bad public attitudes, and misinformed narratives means that people will actually take steps to value or not value other people based on their assessment of your mental wellness or illness, based on their assessment of your value as a human being according to your skin. And if I have bad information about white and black, these two socially made constructs for the purposes of power, I'm struggling not to let my beliefs inform my behaviors. This graphic comes to us by the YWCA of Mankato. We struggle over the meanings of race and equality. We prefer to address the symptoms rather than the social problems and the roots of them. Why are things like they are is bigger than race, in part because of the myth of race. We generally are more comfortable discussing class and gender, and all historical research and present day research shows that if we do not call out race specifically in our conversations, it almost always goes to the bottom and is the last thing, if ever, to be discussed. We often fail to acknowledge the ways that race has been a fundamental axis of social organization in the United States. Race has been a primary means of social control, telling one group they have the power and the other groups that they do not. It's very, very dangerous. Next slide, please. James Baldwin, somebody I suggest people study as often as they can, whenever they can. He was a prolific writer about many things, but particularly about the realities of race. He said, people are trapped in history and history is trapped in them. As I indicated before, when I told you that we were singing the song, all of us little kids, this land is your land, this land is my land, I had no idea I could be hurting other people by singing that song. I had no idea I could be hurting myself, or how long it would take me to understand that, no, that actually wasn't what was going on. That wasn't what was happening. So that history remains trapped in me. The ideas of white and black remain perhaps potentially trapped in me. If I don't do work every day to figure out where I'm at, then my beliefs will unconsciously or consciously inform my behavior. History is trapped in all of us. Next slide, please. When you think about race, I often ask people the question, growing up, where did you get your primary information about race? If you can, just take a moment and write a note to yourself. When's the first time somebody talked to you about race or used the word race? Where do you get your primary information about race today? Please take a moment and write that down. How many personal, cross-cultural, racial relationships do you have today? I'm not talking about your friend at work that you have lunch with sometimes before the virus. I'm talking about personal relationships. Please make a note. And if you would, for just a moment, let's take a minute to reflect on an experience you've had with race, perhaps recently. Don't judge yourself. Just take note of how did it make you feel when you recall whatever it was. And please make note of both. Thank you. The activist Tim Wise, when I interviewed him, said if we were reading a book about race, white people and black people are 500 pages in of necessity, and white people have barely read the foreword. That is not a cut. That is to say, we've never lived in an equitable society that wasn't bound by a foot on the neck called race. We've never lived in a society that is equitable, so we have no common language to talk about how we're going to get out of this trap that has been created. So we are talking about the intersection of stigma, discrimination, bad public attitudes, and misinformation, literally costing people's lives when it comes to the intersection of mental wellness, illness, and race. Next slide, please. Words mean things. That's the poet Tish Jones. You can Google her if you care. The customs, arts, social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation, people, or other social group. No, it doesn't say race. Next slide, please. Race is one word. This is what culture looks like. I suggest to most people that we might get along a lot better if we just closed our eyes and had conversations so we could just drop the whole race thing altogether and meet at the intersection of all these things. Dream time, and being a grandmother, and how we share traditions, and what languages we speak, and how we honor the environment, and describe the Soul Food Sunday that is a part of our family celebrations before the virus every single week. I often tell people, close your eyes to see culture because color is a blinder. Next slide, please. Next slide, if you don't mind. Thank you kindly. Something that's rarely ever talked about are the resiliencies of Black people. You see, when we're portrayed in the media, even on television, even in the movies, even in plays, we're almost always the problem. Well, Black people are not really a problem because we're Black. We are painted as such. Bad information that informs stigma and discrimination and bad public attitudes. Dr. Joseph White became the godfather of Black psychology in 1970 when he birthed the field of Black psychology in Ebony magazine. He challenged the idea that you could send white psychologists out to Black homes and that they could come away with a really effective assessment of what families actually needed because of the lens of race. So for example, a family that had Ebony magazine or Jet magazine in its home and several publications by Black authors would be noted as illiterate by those psychologists. That's not true. But because they weren't reading mainstream magazines, they were considered illiterate. This is part of the difficulty. So the wrong doctor writes the wrong prescription for the wrong problem. So Dr. White wanted to remind the world that Black people have what are at least 7 resiliencies that keep us living in the world in spite of what you know today can be a horrible time and context. The art of improvisation, that is to be reinvented every new generation to figure out how you're going to cope with all the things that your ancestors dealt with and all the new ways those things will keep showing up, because we don't talk about race and attitudes and stigma and belief. Resilience. Every setback, we rebound. We talk about having broken hearts but not broken backs to need to continue forward until Black life is valued by everybody, the same way Black people value other people, the same way Black culture is honored over Black life. A connectedness to others is a huge part of our culture. Can you imagine the transatlantic slave trade using debilitation of the family structure as the primary means of social control? If you steal and sell my daughter, you take my heart. If you took my husband and sold him down the road, you've stolen a piece of me. And what does that do to a people who are then the target of mass incarceration? We need each other desperately. And add the pandemic on top, and no Soul Food Sunday, and our spirituality is desperately affected. But it is that spirituality, not religion. It's the hope that something can be better, that a future can be brighter. The warmth of other suns can grow something different, in the words of Richard Wright. That being Black in the world will be different for my grandchildren in a good way. That we keep moving. That we continue to maintain emotional vitality. Even in the midst of grave difficulty, you might see Black people laughing and celebrating and wonder how in the world could they do that? Because if we didn't have gallows humor, the ability to laugh and cry, to keep from crying, we surely couldn't make it through. And a healthy suspicion of other people who suggest that they love Black people but don't seem to have much evidence that that's the case. And the evidence is quite to the contrary. Can you imagine if you're in a situation where you want to have your mental health evaluated and they only see the mythologies of race and none of your resiliencies? That none of the tools that you're offered, none of the opportunities you're given are aligned with the things you can bring as assets? So what you get is bad attitudes and stigma and misinformed public discourse and discrimination. And sadly for some, mental illness or wellness, Black or not, life or death. Next slide, please. Facts. Culture matters in mental wellness. However you define yourself, inside or outside of a race, however you define yourself in that broad definition of culture that you saw on that slide in so many ways, by your food and your traditions and the things you would share with others about the way you came up and what your grandmother told you, about the value of women in the workplace and what your grandfather told you, about the value of hard work, those things matter. And so one of the things we can always do is get more information to generate new ideas, to challenge the ideas we always held. This land is my land. Culture matters in getting better. SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, offers tips for different cultural communities. Are you a woman who needs help with her sobriety? They have a tip for that. Are you a person who suffers from mental wellness or illness, suffers from mental illness and wants to learn more about how culture can impact your wellness? SAMHSA has tips for that. They also have tip 59 that tells you that culture matters when people are trying to recover, when people are trying to stay well. Resmaa Menakem has written a book titled My Grandmother's Hands, about how we have used in our society the image of the white body as a supreme being, the prettiest, brightest, smartest of everybody, and how that's dangerous to them and to us. Mental Health America, it's a website that has specific information on racism and Black mental health. Racism is toxic. It is a verb like equity, except one doesn't work for everybody, and the other, at least in theory, equity, does. Dr. Joseph White, writing Toward a Black Psychology in 1970 in Ebony magazine on the 7 Resiliencies of Black folk. And Robin DiAngelo, who teaches sometimes with Resma Menachem, has written a book on what she calls white fragility, reasons she offers forward why we don't move forward further on the issues of race. These are opportunities to get information, to get more and better ideas. Last slide, please. When I is replaced with we, even illness becomes wellness. I would be very interested to see who you think said this, and no one will know if you're going to be right or wrong. If you don't mind, before we go into the question and answer, just take a minute to write yourself a note. And heaven help me, I'll remember before we close to tell you exactly who said that. Megan, I turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Lissa. You have a couple other fellow Minnesotans on this call. Myself and Ellie are both Minnesotans, so thank you for being here. We appreciate it. So we have a couple different questions. Can you talk about how the arts have supported racism or confronted it?
That's a complex question. I wouldn't consider myself an arts expert, but what I could tell you as a lover of the arts, arts have both cemented and challenged us around our beliefs. We have created a whole infrastructure. So for example, when I interviewed Dr. Craig Wilder, who wrote Ebony and Ivy, he advised that the people who came across from Europe to settle what became the United States didn't have a plan for their safety. They actually didn't have a plan for sustainable food, but they built universities, even though the group of people who came over initially were highly well educated. They did so to create a doctrine against the people who were here in order to get the land. So much of the art you would see from that period, for example, would be reminiscent of that. The people who need to be moved off the land would be depicted as terrible and horrible and scary, and the people who wanted the land would be depicted as wonderful and free from impurity and free from blemish. At the same time, if art were able to exist in resistance, I'm certain it would have. There would have been other thinking people who would have thought, well, wait a minute. Can you go into another person's house, steal everything, make new rules, and then push them out? Perhaps not. But I'm not familiar with any art that we have in the public discourse from that time period that isn't informing that doctrine. But I'm not an art historian. That's a good question.
So what are some easy solutions to the racial inequality that the country is currently seeing? That's tough.
It is tough. I always tell people, you can worry about yourself. That's what I usually tell people. Clean up your own heart. Ask yourself the questions of your own that you need to ask yourself. When I come up into a situation and I see two people, what comes to mind? Two people who don't look the same. Do I think I might be saved from one and harmed by the other? Do I think about helping this person, but I don't think about helping that person? Does it happen unconsciously? And don't stop when the work is hard, when you realize, oh my gosh, I just raised somebody, or I just decided that their family didn't look like mine, so I didn't dig it, or I just put stigma on somebody. You stop there and then reflect. Where did I get the information that might have caused me to feel that way in the first place? I tell people, don't judge, feel your body and honor it. Ask yourself deeper questions. Where did I get that idea? When did I first think about the value of people who are doing X or Y? When did I learn that Black equated with criminality, was soiled, dirty, and sinister? How early did that start? I'm not saying you did, I'm just saying you ask yourself these questions. I am a white supremacist. This is what I tell people all the time. So are we all, because we are built in a structure that created the idea that white is the highest thing to aspire to, and everybody else just has to live with it. That's not true. And we don't like the words, but it's true. That is what we have been living under in our education system. James Baldwin would say if education, if you're white, is indoctrination to this idea. And if you're not, it's subjugation to the idea. So we built our art, our history, our music, all of it around mythologies that are not fundamentally true. And it is that failure to deal with those myths of heart in our own selves that keeps us from making progress, because you're not going to change the whole world. But by changing yourself, you impact everyone who's around you. Stigma, bad attitudes in the public, discrimination. This is what misinforms narratives. This is what makes people believe that they can equate mental illness with violence. That is not right, and we know it. And we can shout it from the rooftops all day, but people who don't want to know, don't want to know. So if we know, and we can change the people in our own hearts around these ideas, then we have a chance to change everything.
Thank you. This is a couple people have asked this type of question. So I live in an area without a wide variety of ethnicities. What are some general guidelines a person can use to prevent offending another person? And then another question is, how can I increase exposure to people of other races if I do live in an area like this?
Those are excellent questions. I think now more than ever, with the advent of the virus, since many of us are home and on the computer, or at least somewhere on the computer, we can use opportunities to drop into experiences we might not have had. I'll give you an example. The National African American Museum on African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian Museum on African American History. Drop in there and look around and see what's there. It's a safe way. When you're connected on social media and you see a gathering, a virtual gathering of a group you're not generally exposed to, jump on. I mean, it's a very safe way to do that now, and just sit in and be a sponge and ask and learn. If you're in personal interactions with people, just explain, you know, I certainly don't have a lot of experience with people who don't look similar to me. And I am hopeful not to offend as we're evolving in our relationship. But I would like to be open enough, believe that I'm open enough, that if I were to offend you, not asking you to do the work, but that you would help me know that so we could work through it. People are human beings. We have raced each other to the point where we can't even see each other in just plain conversation. And that's sad to me. That robbed us a long time before the COVID virus.
So there's a question about research about current information about sort of white passing.
Are we talking about people who are white who are trying to pass as something else? Or are we talking about people who are not white trying to pass as white? I don't know.
Okay, I'm sorry. We'll go on. So I have a question from Sita Deal, who is the moderator for the last conversation. How can we as NAMI leaders change our culture to make sure people of color feel welcome?
That's excellent. I think begin by examining first individuals, policies, practices, procedures, and beliefs your organization holds dear. So you take an experience, perhaps it's human resources and it's hiring, and perhaps you hardly ever get any people of color who come into the organization, or maybe they come in and they don't stay. Well, you may want to try to figure out what happened in those experiences that might have contributed to why people didn't stay. If they had an exit interview, for example, and there are themes, or if they brought concerns to human resources or to their manager, and there are some themes that you can extrapolate from there. It's almost getting out of your own way to try to examine how might these policies be affecting me if I'm not white, if I'm not heterosexual, if I'm not in a family that the society says is a family, if I don't meet up to all the things that the 5 myths say, then how do those policies affect me? The other thing to do is to start asking and making certain that when you're having these conversations, convene more robust groups. You have lots of volunteers and other people who are connected to other people. Have informal conversations and host them, asking, can we talk about race? Can we explore a couple things together and see if this fits? Because I really want to know whether or not this policy that I'm implementing has consequences I didn't intend. which is almost always the case because our identities are not the same for everybody. So of course I can see the policy might be good for me, but it might be difficult for me to see why that might not be good for someone else. So it's a very serious examination process at the most visceral level, folks. The same way that we talk about needing to do this as individuals and clean up our own heart, an organization doesn't become an organization until the individuals go in it and breathe their breath in there, bad analogy during COVID, through their mask, and turn on the lights and get the organization going. And it dies down every Friday night, excuse me, or whenever the organization closes down until the people return. So the organization doesn't change until the people change.
So someone wants to know, does the Black culture look at mental health different than other cultures?
I'm not sure I can answer that. That's a really, really broad question. I would say that Black people are human beings, and however you perceive the spectrum of how every human being might look at mental wellness or illness, Black people have follow along the same spectrum, the human spectrum. So that's true of every issue, even though we are painted to be monolithic and suggest that we look at the world the same way. That is absolutely not true, and that's not true of mental illness or wellness either.
And how can people of color demand an increase in their mental health care? That's broad as well.
Yeah, it is. I think, honestly, much of what happens in this democracy for people who are not white happens by protest. And I'm not talking about getting into the whole context of destroying property or anything like that. I'm talking about voting. I'm talking about influencing your legislators. I'm talking about using pressure to demand that people write laws and make them more equitable. There are ways. I'm talking about running for office. I'm talking about the local level to the federal level. I'm talking about focusing on every possible way you can influence who gets what and how much, because ultimately that's what politics is about. It's about who gets what and how much. And if people want more mental health care, we're going to have to go get it, because no one's offering it on a platter, sadly. People who don't have any money don't get proper mental health care. People who don't fit the definition don't always get proper access to care. And I haven't figured out yet why we don't understand as a culture that is dangerous for everybody. I don't understand that, but that's just me. I'm nobody, I'm the trainer.
This person says, as a Black person, how can I better challenge and confront white people, especially within NAMI, when enough is not being done to address and meet mental health for people of color communities, especially when other people don't have answers and rather dance around the topic of race instead of having true impactful discourse and following actions?
First of all, I want to just hold that in my heart for a second, because I hear you and I see you. And secondly, I'm talking about the person who posed the question, and you, Megan. Thank you. What I would say is that's a dangerous place to be. It's difficult to know how to answer you honestly, because doing that in an organization, it takes a lot of risk. And if you're going to go against the grain in any way, but particularly around so deeply ingrained issues around the mythologies of race, you risk absolutely alienating yourself, losing your job, being further stigmatized. And so it's hard for me to suggest what kind of risk you take. What I would say to you is assess your risk and reward. What is the likelihood that you're taking the risk is going to result in the kind of change, or at least the beginning of the kind of change that you would like to see, and how much risk you can really take personally for doing that work. And then I would say that sort of defines how much you can do it in the light and how much has to be done without a whole lot of discussion, in perhaps smaller groups, in quieter conversations, in less loud ways. But I would tell you, in my long experience with NAMI, and I really love this organization and appreciate it and admire it, my one concern has always been the lack of cultural diversity in the broadest sense.
And we just have to wrap up. Someone writes, though not a question, but a comment. Great job. Such a difficult subject. You are a brave, beautiful woman.
Bless your soul, beauties. That feels so good. I'm going to tuck that right into my heart. And thank you for staying with me at what I know is a difficult topic. But until we can talk about it, we can't change it. So thank you, NAMI Wisconsin. And thank you for the hope that you brought me with that last piece. I appreciate each of you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Take care.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So now we are going to draw a name for our amazing raffle basket. And Ellie, could you draw a name for us? Brooke, we will get in touch. I wonder if this is the Brooke I've been reaching out to lately. So maybe this is the Brooke I know. We will be in touch. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this session. And now we will have a break for lunch, and we will see you again at 1:15.